Under the fading light of an early autumn evening, the small town of Willow Creek hummed with the sounds of progress, tractors, construction trucks, and men in bright vests shouting orders. Beyond the noise, at the far end of an old dirt road, stood a weathered farmhouse surrounded by rolling fields that had long turned golden with harvest. Inside that farmhouse lived Henry Cole, a 74-year-old farmer whose life had been rooted in that very soil since before the nearby homeowners association even existed. His hands were cracked like old bark, his back bent from decades of labor, and his eyes, though clouded with age, still held the fire of a man who remembered every inch of the land he called home. For years, Henry watched as new houses rose where orchards once stood. The HOA, the Homeowners Association, had come like a quiet storm, buying parcels of land, putting up fences, and deciding how neighborhood beauty should look. Henry had refused to sell. He didn't want manicured lawns and decorative street lamps replacing the wild, honest earth he had tended his whole life. He told them once, "You can't own what you don't understand," and they had laughed. To them, he was just an old man with a crumbling barn and outdated values. When the HOA began construction of a commercial complex just beyond his fence line, Henry noticed something odd. The bulldozers crept further each week, first a few feet, then yards. Stakes marking the boundary lines began appearing deep into what Henry knew was his land. He went to the site manager, a tall man with a reflective vest and a confident smirk. "You've crossed my property," Henry said calmly, holding his worn hat in his hand. The man had chuckled. "Sir, this land is part of the HOA development plan. Check the records, maybe you're mistaken." Henry didn't argue. He simply looked at the young man for a long moment and said softly, "Mistakes grow fast when people stop looking at roots." The workers laughed behind his back. The HOA board labeled him difficult. Even some of his old neighbors, those who had sold their land for big money, said maybe it was time for him to move on. "You can't stop progress, Henry," they said. But Henry wasn't angry. He was patient. He watched as the buildings went up, gleaming glass and steel structures where corn once whispered in the wind. They built offices, shops, and even a small cafe. Every week, trucks rumbled across his field, tearing the ground where his father once plowed. They mocked him openly now. "Poor old man doesn't even know where his land ends anymore." He'd nod politely, smile a little, and walk away with that same quiet dignity that confused everyone who tried to provoke him. What they didn't know was that Henry had every deed, every survey, every map stored in a fireproof box beneath the floorboards of his living room. His father had told him long ago, "Keep your papers safe, son. Land isn't about fences, it's about proof and pride." Those yellowed documents clearly showed that a wide strip of land, exactly where the HOA had built their prized commercial hub, belonged entirely to Henry Cole. Still, Henry waited. He wanted them to finish. He wanted them to pour their money, their pride, their arrogance into the soil that had always been his. He sat each evening on his porch, sipping black coffee, watching their lights glow brighter while his house grew smaller in their shadow. But deep inside, he felt no bitterness, only a quiet knowing that truth, like a seed, takes time to sprout. Months passed. The grand opening came. The HOA threw a celebration with ribbons, speeches, and champagne. The local paper called it the future of Willow Creek. Henry showed up, dressed in his old coat and cleanest hat, standing at the back while the crowd applauded. The HOA president, a sharp-dressed man named Robert Finch, spotted him and whispered something to the others. A few laughed. Someone said, "Look, the old farmer came to see what real landowners do." Henry smiled. He stayed until the end, waiting for the crowd to thin before walking up to Robert. "Fine work you've done here," he said kindly. "Looks expensive." Robert nodded smugly. "It's progress, Mr. Cole. Something this town needed. You should consider selling your remaining acres, we could make good use of them." Henry tipped his hat. "Maybe," he said, "but first, I'd like to show you something." The next morning, Henry drove to the county courthouse with a folder under his arm. By afternoon, the news began to spread. The entire 12-acre commercial site, the jewel of the HOA's new expansion, was sitting on land that legally belonged to Henry Cole. The title, untouched since 1954, listed him as the sole owner. Somehow, through a combination of assumption and oversight, the HOA had built everything on land that was never theirs to begin with. When the letter from Henry's attorney arrived at the HOA office, Robert Finch went pale. The paper was brief. "Mr. Henry Cole, the rightful owner of the property currently occupied by the Willow Creek Commercial Development, hereby requests immediate cessation of operations pending resolution of land rights. Panic followed. The developers, investors, and board members scrambled through files, contracts, and legal records, only to find that every document pointed back to Henry's deed. That evening, while the HOA held an emergency meeting, Henry sat on his porch, the glow of their new buildings reflecting in his eyes. He didn't smile, he just watched. He had been quiet for so long, and now the soil itself seemed to whisper justice. The next morning, reporters arrived. "Mr. Cole," one asked, "is it true you own the land beneath the new buildings?" Henry nodded. "Always did. What are you going to do now?" Another asked eagerly. "Are you going to take it back?" "Sue them." Henry looked out at the rising sun over the glass towers. "They mocked me," he said softly, "but I don't need to destroy what others built. I just want them to remember where it stands." In the following weeks, the town buzzed with speculation. Would he evict them? Would he sell it back for millions? Lawyers came, contracts were offered, and every offer had more zeros than the last. Yet Henry refused them all. He called for a meeting with the HOA board, held right inside their new office, on his land. When he entered the room, everyone fell silent. He placed the original deed on the polished table. "This land fed my family for generations," he began, his voice steady but gentle. "You built your future on my past. But I'm not here to tear it down. I've seen enough people fight over land. I just want one thing." Robert leaned forward cautiously. "And what's that?" Henry looked around the room, at the faces that had mocked him, the hands that had pushed him aside. "You'll keep this place running," he said. "Let it serve the people, give jobs, build community. But 20% of all profits from this site will go into a town fund, scholarships, food banks, and helping farmers who are struggling. That's the price of using my soil." The room was stunned. Robert blinked. "You could own everything here," he said quietly. "You could take it all." Henry smiled faintly. "Maybe. But what good is ownership if no one grows from it?" Word of Henry's decision spread quickly. The town that had once mocked him now hailed him as a hero. The HOA, cornered by public opinion and their own guilt, agreed to his terms. They signed a binding agreement that ensured a portion of every dollar earned on that land went back to the community. Over time, that fund rebuilt the local school, saved several small farms from foreclosure, and even opened a health clinic for low-income families. One crisp winter morning, Henry visited the site. Where once there had been mockery, now there was respect. A small plaque stood near the entrance, reading, "Dedicated to Henry Cole, the man who taught us who really owned the soil." Children waved to him as he walked by. The cafe owner handed him coffee for free. Even Robert Finch, the once proud HOA president, greeted him warmly whenever their paths crossed. Henry continued to live in his farmhouse, quietly tending the little garden behind it. The land beyond was no longer his alone, but he didn't mind. He often said to visitors, "The earth doesn't care who signs the papers. It belongs to those who care for it." Years passed, and the story of the old farmer became a kind of legend in Willow Creek. They told it in schools, in church gatherings, and at town meetings, a reminder of humility and justice. When Henry passed away peacefully one spring morning, the town gathered at the fields he had once farmed. The mayor spoke softly. "He showed us that owning land isn't about fences, it's about heart." And long after his passing, whenever rain fell over the town and soaked into the soil, people said it carried Henry's spirit, quiet, strong, and unyielding, nourishing everything that grew above it. Because in the end, the HOA had built their empire on his ground, but Henry Cole had built something far greater. He had planted dignity, wisdom, and compassion so deep that no one could ever uproot them.